Hello, Rev'd Julie here from St Mark's Church in Brampton with this week's reflection on Matthew chapter 14 verses 13 to 21. Hello everyone. So whether you're reading this as a letter or as an email attachment or watching this video clip on Facebook or on YouTube, or perhaps you're even listening to me in church, welcome. We continue our reflections on the stories of Jesus from the book of Matthew, and this week we step into a story where all of the teaching on the kingdom of heaven of the past few weeks is put into practice against a background of tragedy and trauma. The opening line of the gospel reading, Matthew chapter 14 and verse 13, says this: "Now when Jesus heard this, ... But hang on a second, what had Jesus heard?" In verse 12, the disciples of John the Baptist had arrived to tell Jesus that their master had been cruelly beheaded in tragic and quite unbelievable circumstances. Do read chapter 14, verses 1 to 12 to find out more. Bearing news of this tragedy, they had come to find Jesus, as he was quite possibly John's nearest living relative, and he was certainly known to them, and was the first person they decided to turn to. Tragic and traumatic news for Jesus and those around him, grief and sorrow and anger mixed with anxiety and fear and foreboding. Does any of this sound familiar in our day? So what was Jesus' response? We read in verse 13, "He withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place." In the language of today, he self-isolated. He shielded himself. He took time out. He did what he knew would give him space and time to be alone with his thoughts and with his prayers. Jesus knew that there was something about solitude, physical exercise, the rhythm of rowing, being connected to the natural world that would be helpful to the soul when processing trauma and tragedy. With the news of John's death, Jesus found himself at one of those points of decision. Life would carry on, but would never be the same as it was. Without John, there would be a new normal. Would he continue to proclaim the kingdom of heaven in word and action, knowing his path would also lead to suffering and death? Would Jesus keep rowing, or would he come ashore? The new normal for Jesus as he brought the boat to shore was that the tragedy and trauma were replaced with courage, compassion, and challenge. 3 C's that put all the teaching on the kingdom of heaven into practice here on earth. Jesus came ashore, got out of the boat, and realized that the great crowd had seen where he was going and had followed. Perhaps as people began to hear what had happened to John, their own stories of tragedy and of trauma led them to not only turn to Jesus, but to pursue him. The physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual journey in the boat from one place to another had not depleted Jesus, but rather had energized him with courage to keep going. There was work to be done to proclaim the kingdom of heaven. And right on the back of courage came compassion in verse 14. Now, not to put too fine a point on it, the Greek word that is used is that Jesus had a gut-wrenching, deep physical yearning to show love and pity. Compassion is not found in the head alone. It is found in the heart and in the gut. Compassion is a whole body experience, and Jesus acted on it as soon as he saw the crowd by moving among them and healing the sick. The kingdom of heaven is like this, proclaims Matthew, and involves not just Jesus, but all of his followers. The disciples suggested the crowd be sent away in verse 15. Not so, says Jesus, I challenge you, give them something to eat. In verse 16, the challenge to the disciples was to bring Jesus what they had. Let him bless it and return it to them, for them to then go and feed the hungry. They had 5 loaves and 2 fish, and they had Jesus. Then they fed everyone until they were satisfied, and when they picked up the leftovers, they saw the evidence of God's generous, abundant, life-giving, practical support and provision. Heal the sick and feed the hungry, one person at a time. So this week, I want to encourage us all to follow the example of Jesus, to acknowledge the tragedy and trauma of our time, to seek the solace of solitude, nature, exercise, to decide when the time is right for us to come ashore, to continue the work of sharing the kingdom of heaven with courage and compassion, and to respond to the challenge of being alongside the sick and the hungry. Where do we start? Well, we start with what we have. We have the Lord's Prayer. We have the prayers and the Bible readings from the daily office. We can fill the food bank hamper. We can offer money and time. Whatever we have, we can offer it to Jesus. And so hear the words, your kingdom come. Amen.